Okay, so in this video, we're going to think about how our story about employer discrimination differs when instead of having a bunch of equally prejudiced employers, we're going to have some employers that are very prejudiced and other employers who aren't that prejudiced at all. So to think about this, let's imagine that we had different values of D, right, our discrimination coefficient, and then we have employers arranged from least prejudice to most prejudice. And let's arrange them by percentile. So let's say we had 100 employers, right? We're going to have the least prejudiced employer all the way to the most prejudiced employer. Right, so we can think of this as the percentile. Great. And let's say that we've got levels of discrimination, or levels of D, levels of distaste, towards non-white employees that range from a low of 0 to a high of, let's say, $10. Right, just to throw out a number. So the least prejudiced employer doesn't care if they're hiring black employees or white employees, or non-white employees or white employees. The most prejudiced employer perceives non-white employees to be $10 more expensive than they actually are. Okay, so based on what we said before, and based on the fact that we're thinking about a competitive labor market, we're going to have to know, we know that all of these employers are going to face the same wage for white workers and the same wage for non-white workers, right? So wage for whites and wage for non-whites, same for all employers. Right? And so we can put on here some wage gap that's going to be the same for all employers. Now, on top of this, what we know from what we did before is that if an employer has a distaste for non-white workers D greater than the wage gap, they're only going to hire white workers. And if they've got a distaste less than the wage gap, they're only going to hire non-white workers. Right? In other words, we can draw a dividing line here. I'm going to call this percentile star. I'm going to call this D star. And say all employers with a level of distaste towards non-white workers greater than the wage gap are going to only hire white workers. And all the employers with a level of distaste less than that, D star, are going to only hire non-white workers. This makes sense? So effectively what we're saying is every single workplace, except for the one right at D star, is going to be entirely segregated. Right? Every non-white worker is going to work for a relatively less prejudiced employer. Every white worker is going to work for a relatively more prejudiced employer. And the difference in wages between white workers and non-white workers is going to be given just by the level of distaste for this marginal employer, right? The employer who's just prejudiced enough to be indifferent between hiring a white worker and hiring a non-white worker. Okay, so what this is going to mean is that this level of wage gap, right, wage for whites versus wage for non-whites, is going to have to be set by what's necessary to get all of the non-white labor supply into employers that are less prejudiced and all the white labor supply into employers that are more prejudiced, right? In other words, if we had perfectly inelastic supply of labor for white and non-white workers, just to make things simple, we would say that P star here is going to equal the percent of all workers who are non-white. Right, so what we're saying here is, if our labor force was 20% non-white, then the wage gap would be set by the 20th percentile least prejudiced employer, right? The employer who is more prejudiced than 20% of employers, less prejudiced than 80% of employers. If instead our workforce was 80% non-white, then our wage gap would be set by the 80th percentile most prejudiced employer, right? The employer who is less prejudiced than 20% of employers, more prejudiced than 80% of employers. Okay, so this has an interesting implication about the way that discrimination is going to change in a labor market when the percent of employees who are non-white changes, right? Which is that if the level of prejudice stays exactly the same, right? In other words, this line here relating the percentile of discrimination to D, or this percentile of prejudice to D, stays exactly the same. If we have an increase in the number of non-white workers, we're going to go from having a wage gap like this to having a wage gap like this, right? So for example, if we wanted to guess as to whether non-white employees are going to be more discriminated against or going to have a bigger wage gap, in El Paso, Texas, where 17% of the workforce is white, or 83% is non-white, or in Bangor, Maine, where 95% of the workforce is white, right? Non-Hispanic white, I should say. 5% is non-Hispanic, is non-Hispanic white, is non-white. We would guess that if the level of prejudice among employers was the same, the wage gap would have to be larger in El Paso than it is in Bangor. Now, of course, we might also expect that the level of prejudice might be more in a community that's very, very heavily white. But in fact, when researchers have looked at this, they've found that when you try to measure the level of prejudice for the marginal employer, that's going to be more related to the wage gap than is the level of prejudice for the average employer. It also suggests that when you see large changes in the size of the non-white workforce, so for example, in the early 1900s, from about 1918 to 1970, very, very large numbers of black people moved from the South to northern cities, particularly cities like Chicago that were the nexus of railroad hubs. And so Chicago's black population increased from about 2% of the population in 1910 to about 33% of the population in 1970. And over that time period, Chicago went from being a city that was well known for having relatively little prejudice against African American workers to being a city that was famous for having very high levels of racial segregation and racial violence. And so one story behind this could be maybe the level of prejudice didn't change, but the marginal employer shifted from being one of the least prejudiced employers in the city to being a relatively more prejudiced employer in the city. We might expect similar things in Europe as a result of the refugee crisis, as the fraction of people from the Middle East has increased dramatically in countries like Sweden. Okay, so another question to ask here is, if we're saying that the level of wage gap is going to depend just on the prejudices of the marginal employer, how is it going to affect things if some employers actively prefer non-white workers, right? So we've assumed so far that D is always positive, right? That you're either unprejudiced or you're prejudiced in favor of white workers and against non-white workers. But what if actually this axis extends down a little bit and we have some employers who actively prefer to hire non-white workers, right? So maybe instead of this black line, we have instead this blue line relating your percentile of prejudice to your level of D. Is that going to have any effect on the wage gap? So the answer is no, it won't, right? Because these less prejudiced employers were only hiring non-white workers anyway, right? So this is going to make the people who actively prefer non-white workers even happier with their decision to not hire any white people, right? To only hire non-white workers, but it won't have any effect on the market clearing wage. And so in some ways, this is a little bit of an economic theory basis for the claim you might hear people say that racism is prejudice plus power, right? We can say that if you have a small number of people who have some prejudice, but not enough so that the marginal employer is prejudiced, that's going to have no effect whatsoever on wages, right? So we could have a significant number of of employers actively prefer non-white workers and have that not generate a wage gap in favor of non-white workers and against white workers. Okay, so given this, right, given that we're going to have different behavior by less prejudiced employers and more prejudiced employers, a natural next question to ask is, how is this going to affect employer profits, right? In other words, are the employers that are hiring non-white workers going to earn a higher or lower profit than are the employers that are hiring white workers? And to think through this, I want to make a distinction here between accounting profit, right, the profit in dollars that you're earning, and perceived economic profit. So from an accounting profit perspective, this D here, right, this distaste for hiring minority workers, doesn't play a role in calculating profit, right? It'll play a role in determining your economic choices, but then when we say, are you operating in the red or are you operating in the black, we're going to say that this has no effect. On the other hand, if we think about perceived economic profits, this distaste is an economic cost that's experienced by the employers who are paying. And so if we think about, are employers going to enter or exit markets on the basis of their perceived profits, this distaste for hiring minority workers is going to play a role in their economic decisions and therefore is going to be included in their economic profits. So moving forward, I'm going to think primarily about these economic profits. Okay, and I'm going to start by thinking about the profit maximization decision and therefore the labor demand decision of a firm that's only hiring white workers, which I'm going to call a white firm, following Borges. So the profits of the economic profits of a quote-unquote white firm are going to be, I'll call this pi of e's for economic profits of firm I are going to equal price times quantity, right, minus our wage bill, right? So minus the wage of a white worker times the number of workers. And this is going to be for a firm that has DI greater than D star, where D star, right, is that marginal level of distaste that leads a firm to switch from hiring white workers to hiring black workers. Okay, so if a firm's going to maximize their profits, right, they're going to hire workers up until the point that the next worker would cost them more than they would produce, right? So they're going to hire workers up until price times the marginal product of labor equals their wage. Right? And the reason for this is we have diminishing marginal returns in labor. Right? In other words, each worker is a little less productive than the one before. We're going to have a marginal product of labor like this times price. We're going to have a constant wage rate. Each worker up till this point, right, is making us money. Each worker past here is losing us money. So that's going to be L star W. L star W. Right? So far, so good? Great. Okay, so quick question here. If I'm a prejudiced firm, right, I'm a quote-unquote white firm, so that I'm not hiring any minority workers, is my profit maximizing choice of labor going to have any relationship to how prejudiced I am? In other words, is the marginally prejudiced firm, right, a firm where DI is just barely higher than D star, going to have any differences in profits or any differences in the number of workers they hire than will the most prejudiced firm? And the answer to this is going to be that it's not going to matter at all how prejudiced you are once you go past this threshold where you're no longer hiring any non-white workers. And the reason is, right, I'm not paying this distaste cost because I'm not hiring any non-white workers. And as a result, the cost that I'm actually paying for my workers is constant with respect to how discriminatory I am. Okay, and so then likewise, if we think about the profit maximization decision of firms that only hire non-white workers, which we could call non-white firms, in other words, firms where the level of distaste towards non-white workers is less than D star, and of course we'll include in here firms that actually actively prefer non-white workers, we're going to say that our economic profits are going to equal our revenue, right, price times the output produced by the non-white workers that we hire, minus our perceived economic costs of each worker, which are going to be wage non-white plus discrimination, right, times L and W. All right, good. And so for the same reasons, we're going to hire workers up until the marginal revenue product, or the marginal revenue I get from each worker, equals the worker's wage plus the level of discrimination, right? The marginal revenue I get from each worker equals my perceived marginal cost of hiring each worker. Okay, and I want to ask you again, right? Is it going to matter how prejudiced I am once I'm below the level of prejudice that leads me to hire non-white workers? In other words, is a totally unprejudiced firm, a firm where DI equals 0, going to make different decisions than a firm where DI is just barely below D star? And if you think about this, the answer is yes, they've got to make different decisions, right? If you're a completely unprejudiced firm, you're going to perceive the cost of hiring an extra worker as being lower than if you're a firm that has some prejudice that's just below D star. So as a result, you're going to hire more workers, right? And likewise, as a result of that, you're going to earn more profit. Both more accounting profit because of the fact that you're going to hire workers up until the point that they're, the marginal worker is earning as many dollars as they cost you, as opposed to hiring fewer workers than that. But also, you're going to have a higher perceived economic profit because you're not paying this distaste cost here to hire additional non-white workers. So one way to think about this is, if we plotted our perceived costs in terms of dollars, hence the number of workers that we hired, every firm has the same marginal revenue product, right? The same price times marginal product of labor. But firms that hire white workers are going to pay a cost wage for whites, right? Firms that are prejudiced, but not so prejudiced as to hire white workers, are going to pay some cost wage of non-whites plus DI, right? And firms that are completely unprejudiced are going to perceive a cost per worker equal to the wage of non-white workers. So what this is going to mean is firms that hire white workers are going to hire fewer workers than prejudiced firms that hire non-white workers. We're going to hire fewer workers than totally unprejudiced firms that hire non-white workers, right? And there's a side note here that I want to focus on for a minute, which is that as a consequence of this, because of the fact that there's fewer workers per firm in firms that hire white workers, what we're going to see is that the average productivity and the marginal productivity of white workers is going to end up higher than the marginal productivity of non-white workers, despite the fact that their actual abilities are exactly the same in this model, right? Because of the fact that employers are discriminating, this is going to result in white workers ending up with a higher level of productivity because there's fewer workers per firm and marginal product is decreasing with the number of workers. This is something that's called overcrowding. And it's an insight that was developed by an economist named Barbara Bergman in the 1970s to explain these two sets of facts. The fact that white and black workers tended to work in different firms and in fact different occupations, and the fact that white workers tended to be more productive than black workers. And essentially what she said is, just observing differences in productivity doesn't really tell you anything about the inherent abilities of different types of workers. So it would be completely wrong to look at this difference in productivity and conclude from that that white workers are paid more than black workers because of the fact that they're more productive. In fact, it's the opposite. Because of the fact that white workers are paid more than black workers, that generates more productivity for them. Okay, on top of this, I want to think about this question we started with, which is about profits, right? How do the profits of firms that hire white workers compare to the profits of firms that hire non-white workers? And what we can argue is, it must be the case that the profits of firms that only hire white workers are going to be lower in this model than the profits of firms that hire non-white workers. So to see this, let's imagine that firms that hire white workers hired the same number of workers as firms that hire non-white workers, which we know isn't true. So we could say we've got the profits of firms of what we'll call white firms, pi W, given at the number of workers, L star W. Right? So when they're hiring at L star W. And we want to know, are these going to be greater or less than the profits of what we'll call non-white firms, pi NW, if they hired L star W workers. Right? But of course, they're hiring non-white workers rather than white workers. Now, what we know is that the wages of non-white workers plus the distaste has to be less than the wages of white workers for these firms, or they wouldn't hire, right? So we know, in other words, that the wage of non-white workers plus this distaste for firms that don't hire white workers has to be less than the wage of white workers. So this is going to have to be less than this, right? They're going to have identical revenues because they're hiring the same number of workers. So it has to be the case that the profits are going to be lower when their costs of labor are higher, right? On top of this, now we're going to say, well, are the profits for firms that hire non-white workers higher or lower when they hire at L star W than when they hire at L star NW. Well, they have to be lower when they hire at L star W than when they hire at L star NW, right? Because at L star W, there's this whole triangle of profit here, right? Where they could hire additional workers who would produce more revenue than they cost the firm. So we're also going to know that pi NW at L star W is less than pi NW at L star NW. I'll say NWR, right? And so as a result, it has to be the case that pi W is less than pi NW. Has to be the case that less prejudiced employers are earning greater economic profits than are more prejudiced employers. And on top of that, it has to be the case that the less prejudiced you are, the higher the profits you're earning for exactly the same reasons, right? If you're someone who's totally unprejudiced, you're an employer who's totally unprejudiced, you're getting more workers at a lower cost than somebody who's a little bit prejudiced but is still hiring non-white workers. And so as a result, we're going to have it be the case that the lower your level of D is, the higher your level of economic profits are. So to summarize this, why don't we make a graph where we compare the profit level of each firm to their level of distaste towards minority workers, right? Towards their level of B. What we would see is, at the threshold D star, for firms that are hiring only white workers, they're earning a constant level of profit, regardless of how prejudiced they are, because of the fact that they're not hiring any non-white workers, so they're bearing the full cost of prejudice by having to hire white workers at a high wage. On the other hand, for less prejudiced firms, right, what we're calling non-white firms, the level of profit is increasing as your level of discrimination decreases towards zero, right? In fact, it would continue to decrease if we had a level of discrimination below zero, because then you're getting this positive utility benefit from hiring each additional worker. But essentially what's happening here is there's two things leading to this increased profit. The first thing is just that you've got this lower psychic cost of discriminating. And the other thing is you're actually earning higher dollar profits because of the fact that you're hiring more workers, and you're hiring workers closer and closer and closer to the economically efficient number of workers. And so, by the way, when Borjas makes this graph, he's going to have a discrete jump here because of the fact that he's only considering dollar profits. He's not considering economic profits. Okay, so we've got this situation, right, where firms that hire white workers are earning less than firms that hire non-white workers. And where the less prejudiced you are, the more profit you're earning. But what we've said in the past is, when we have perfectly competitive markets, we must have free entry and exit of firms, and that's going to result in economic profits going towards zero, right? If economic profits are above zero, you're going to have entry. New firms are going to want to come in to take advantage of those profits. If you have economic profits below zero, you're going to have exit. Firms are going to flee the market to avoid economic losses. But we can't possibly have it be the case that all of these different firms each have economic profits of zero, right? Because if the firms that are hiring white workers had economic profits of zero, the firms that are hiring non-white workers would have to have positive economic profits. So let's think about what this is going to mean. To start with, let's imagine that the firms hiring white workers were earning an economic profit of zero, meaning that the firms hiring non-white workers are earning a positive economic profit. And the less prejudiced they are, the larger that positive economic profit is. Well, as a result of that, what we're going to expect is we're going to have entry of potential employers who are unprejudiced, right? If you're an employer who doesn't have prejudices against non-white workers, and you realize that you can earn positive economic profits by entering this market, you're going to have an incentive to do so. And what that's going to do is it's going to change this graph we drew that produced the wage gap to begin with, right? If we again ranked our employers by level of distaste from 0 to 10, right? And then we have their percentile, right, from 0 to 100. if we started out like this, where we have some fraction non-white of our employees given here. So we have P star here, and therefore D star here, right? What we said is we're going to have entry of less prejudiced employers. In other words, we're going to shift this distribution out like this, right? We're going to basically increase the number of employers overall, which is going to squeeze these more prejudiced employers. Sorry, I didn't quite draw this right. We'll have entry, right? We'll squeeze these more prejudiced employers. We're going to have more employers at each low level of discrimination as a result of entry. And what that's going to do is it's going to lower our D star, right, and result in a smaller wage gap between white and non-white employees. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to increase the number of employers overall, which is going to have to lower the price of the output that's being produced, increase the wage level of employees, and therefore lower overall profit levels, right? So if this was the zero profit line before, the new zero profit line is going to move up something like this. And all of these employers that were only hiring white workers are going to go from earning zero economic profits to earning negative economic profits. So what this is going to do is, over time, it's going to drive the more prejudiced employers out of this labor market and replace them with less prejudiced employers. And if we have perfectly competitive markets, right, no anti-economic competition, and we have a sufficient stock of potentially unprejudiced employers, right, in other words, we have more and more people who can enter this market and take advantage of the economic profits gained for people who don't mind hiring non-white workers, what we're going to expect is that over time, this discrimination is going to trend towards zero. In other words, employer preference discrimination is not going to be able to maintain itself over the long term in a perfectly competitive market because of the fact that discriminatory firms are going to earn negative economic profits. So to the extent that we buy this argument, this is a really explosive argument, right? It's an argument for saying that regardless of where prejudices come from, right? We haven't said anything about why there's this level D at all, but regardless of where prejudices come from, competitive economic markets will result in discrimination disappearing, right? We could have prejudice, we could have many people have distaste for non-white employees, but that prejudice will not lead over the long run to discrimination because the costs of that discrimination will be too high. And what Becker argues is, as a result of this, if we see that employers are discriminating against their workers, that's going to be an indication that either there is a lack of competition, right? In other words, there's not going to be this entry of new firms to take advantage of this economic opportunity and push discriminatory firms out of the market, or there has to be some other dynamic at play. So in the next videos, we're going to think about what some of those other dynamics might be that explain why, while in this model, we can't have employer discrimination, in the real world, we see discrimination so much of the time.